Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the August Literary Modiin author event. Before we get started, I have a few quick words of introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And I usually say in this spiel that we're not far from the airport and please come visit. But having just returned from the States, I can tell you that travel is not so easy these days. Right now, I'm actually in Bidud, which is quarantine. So today's event for sure is going to be the highlight of my week. But whenever travel is normalized again, please do come visit. I'd also like to dedicate tonight's event to the memory of one of my oldest writing friends, back when writing for me meant journalism. And that's my friend Josh Mitnick, who passed away in Tel Aviv yesterday after a battle with lymphoma. Some of you may have known him, and many more of you might recognize his byline, "May his memory be a blessing." Back to Literary Modiin. So we have a large population of English speakers here. And in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers we have here. And we held several in-person events. But when the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and welcome attendees from all over the world. Tomorrow, I'm going to send around like a thank you note and the recording, and you'll also get a list of all the books of people that we've hosted in the past. So please check out their books as well, and welcome to many of the authors that have appeared here before. The format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have a large attendance today, so everyone's on mute, and you can put your questions in the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, you can send a private note in the chat to me. And we're broadcasting this live on Facebook, and I think in Literary Modiin. So if you're on Facebook, feel free to start a watch party. So now I will introduce our first author of the evening. Judy Bolton-Fasman is the arts and culture writer for JewishBoston.com. Her essays and reviews have appeared in major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, a host of literary magazines, as well as 2 essay anthologies. She is a 4-time winner of the Simon Rockower Award for Personal Essay from the American Jewish Press Association. Her memoir, Asylum, a Memoir of Family Secrets, is published by Mandel Villar Press and is available online at various book outlets, including bookshop.org. And her publication date, I learned she has 2 publication dates. One was last week and one is September 9th. So Mazel Tov, Judy, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie, for having me here today. I'm really honored. And thank you, Alice and Haim, for being here as well. And I look forward to hearing your words. Since you mentioned that I have 2 publication dates, I'm not exactly sure how that happened. And I'll just briefly say that the original date that I wanted was September 9th because I liked the numerology. 9 and 9 is 18. And it's my son's birthday. But when I went to look for my book on Amazon, I saw that they had appointed the August 24th date. So I like to say that my book is a Jewish book in that it has 2 birthdays. It has a secular birthday and it has a Jewish birthday according to the lunar calendar. So I guess that's the best explanation I can offer for why there are 2 publication dates. A word about how I came to write Asylum. I think I've been writing Asylum all my life in some ways, but technically the book started as an essay, or not an essay really, but as journal entries and various essays in 2004. The journal part of it was the year I said the Kaddish for my father in the year 2002, 2003. I had been somewhat distant from Judaism, and I decided that I would try and say the Kaddish for him every day. And that presented some logistical challenges in the fact that at the time my children were small and I had to get to a synagogue every day. I mean, I decided I would only do it for the evening prayers. I couldn't do it 3 times a day. So I kept a journal of that. I kept a journal of the various minyanim that I went to. I kept a journal of what it felt like to re-engage with my father after his long illness, albeit it was posthumously. And then I started writing the book in a workshop around 2004. And I realized a couple of years into it that it read more like a diary and something that I would leave my children, rather than a book that other people would want to read. But I didn't scrap it, I kept going. And then in 2008, as you'll hear from the excerpt I'm going to read, I decided to research who my father was. I always had inklings of who he was. He was a very silent, mysterious guy. He spent a lot of time in Latin America in the 1950s, and I won't say anything more about that. You can draw your own conclusions until you read the book. And I decided to start interviewing people, those people who were still left, because my father was a much older dad, those people who were still left that remembered him and remembered um, his trips to Latin America, and even remembered in some cases his boyhood. So I started putting all of that together, and I uncovered A Big Family Secret, which is the subtitle of the book, A Memoir of Family Secrets. And I went from there. So I come by my, I don't want to call it nosiness, but I come by my curiosity, I guess. Uh, Honestly, my name is Judy Bolton. Um, at least it was Judy Bolton as a standalone before I married. And Judy Bolton was a fictional girl detective in the 1940s who had a popular mystery series. And I found out about the Judy Bolton books when I was quite young, maybe 6 or 7 years old. And I was always thrilled that I shared a name with this fictional character who I considered to be sort of semi famous, even though, you know, Nancy Drew was sort of the more popular girl detective. And I sort of adapt that persona and play with it in the book. So I think I'll just start reading the excerpt I chose. I chose this one because this is Literary Modiin, and it's coming to us from Israel. So this is the Israel part of the book where I'll just read and you'll see. And I'm going to switch glasses because in addition to taking years and years to write the book, I like to tell people I'm a debut author at the age of 60. Um, I this is my first book, but it isn't my first book. I have a couple of books and a short story collection unpublished, and I've been writing all my life. And as I mentioned before, there have been stirrings of Asylum in much of my work. So here we go. I'm reading from Asylum. I've always had some sort of dyslexia when it came to reading Hebrew. I frequently stumbled over the hulking letters as I tried to connect the Morse code like vowels underneath them. In Israel, I was even more confounded when I discovered that the native speakers did not use those vowels when reading. They absorbed the language in large gulps. Hebrew, I quickly discerned, was so vital, so real, so different from my old and starchy associations with it. During my extended time in Israel, I came to feel as if I were on the verge of understanding the language. Israel was also God's backyard, where Hebrew had been transformed into a modern language. It morphed into the utilitarian usage of street signs and restaurant menus. In the street names alone, Zionist icons mingled with medieval Jewish philosophers and biblical archetypes. Jabotinsky Street, Rambam Street, Queen Esther Street. Emek Rephaim, one of Jerusalem's main drags, had a street named that referenced in the book of in the book of Joshua and 2 Samuel. For my parents, Israel represented the figure of biblical David, as in David and Goliath, and they cheered the country on as a beloved underdog that could prevail in any fight. It was the country where we sent the small change we collected in blue and white Jewish National Fund boxes to plant trees in honor of our grandparents, a gesture that delighted Grandpa Bolton. It was a land as fabled to me as Castro's Cuba when I was a child, and I'll just quickly mention here my mother is a Cuban Jew. Israel was far away, unattainable. The only way to get there was on an airplane my mother refused to take. It was the land of her lost love, the doctor who left her. It was the land she fretfully said we would escape to if a Holocaust ever happened in America. When there was news about Israel on the radio or television, my parents shushed us, and when I was 6 years old, my father seemed palpably shaken during the 1967 Six-Day War. During one of the summer nights of fighting in far off Israel, he sat at the edge of my bed. We need Israel to win this war, he said, adding softly, pray. It was an unusual request for him to make. The closest he came to doing anything religious was to drop my mother and me off at synagogue services. But on that warm June night, at his behest, we prayed for Israel and her brave soldiers. It was startling that my father suddenly leaned on God so explicitly for a good outcome. Until then, I hadn't observed him rely on God for anything. In my child's mind, his prayers worked. Israel won the war in just 6 days. Perhaps my father's way to use prayer sparingly was potent after all. My mother, clearly distraught over Israel's predicament in the early days of the war, still said the nightly Shema with me. But this time we prayed harder, we implored further, we affirmed the Lord is God and the Lord is one. My father's faith was encapsulated in the odd homespun piece of theology he adopted that went like this: God made the world, but the Dutch made Holland. This time in Jerusalem, that aphorism translated as God gave us Israel, but the Jews won back Jerusalem. Throughout my season of memorializing, Israel was soaked in memory and transformed into the exclusive land of Kaddish. It was a haunted place, and for me, the eeriness of that time started at the Passover holiday. From ancient times, Passover was designated as one of the three Jewish harvest festivals, festivals that later in the rabbinic period ended with the Yizkor memorial service. I pictured my ancestors floating, taking in the prayers and the pleas of the living during such a service. After all, hadn't Margarita and Josh, these were two psychics that I consult earlier in the book, told me in our other worldly sessions that Grandma Bolton's spirit was sitting next to me? Shortly after the Passover holiday, Israelis go on to remember their dead and their wounded as they commemorate fallen soldiers and Holocaust victims the day after Israel's Independence Day. My father was part of the generation that lived through the 1947 United Nations partition plan that established the Jewish state. He cherished Israel and no doubt would have admired the young Israelis, both men and women, wearing the uniform of their country. My mother, on the other hand, would have tried to seek out Manuel among the throngs of people in Jerusalem's center. Israel is also a country of paradox. On Emek Rephaim, I loved to people watch from one of its many cafes, always amazed that there I was, the first in my original nuclear family to see Israel. Yet in one of those coffee houses, a chatty place of cappuccinos and strong Turkish coffee, there was a plaque in the entryway memorializing a 20-year-old woman and her father who died after a suicide bomber struck in the late 1980s. It had been the day before her wedding. Nevertheless, Jerusalem always felt to me like the safest place in the world. I'm going to skip down a little bit. I went back to the wall on another Shabbat evening to say the Kaddish for my father again, but I had to admit I was at a stalemate in my praying. I looked for Dad in Israel's prayer-saturated skies, but instead I was the tourist making Shiva calls in Jerusalem that Amichai portrayed in his poem Tourists. They come here to visit the mourners. They sit in Yad Vashem, wear grave faces at the Wailing Wall. They take pictures with the important dead at Rachel's tomb and Herzl's tomb and Ammunition Hill. The women on the other side of me were so fervent in their swaying back and forth to God's words, so practiced in the choreography of prayer, bowing and plowing through it like actors running their lines. Collectively, they evoked the rhythms of minyans I had attended at Kehilloth Israel and the Great Synagogue in Rome, buzzy affairs where the prayer train took off, regardless of who made it on board. These women jostled for limited spaces up front, where they held their prayer books with one hand and placed the other on the wall. I could not match their intensity, and stayed back and watched. A woman I had seen begging for alms on non-holy days stood next to me muttering prayers. She tugged at my arm. You too, Tefillah, she said in her fractured English. She was giving me permission to pray, bestowing me with the gift of speaking to God. I opened my father's prayer book and began. When I was leaving, careful to walk backwards from the wall as tradition dictated, she slipped a bracelet of red thread with a tinny charm against the evil eye in my palm. These were the tokens she gave out during the week to people who spared her a shekel or two. Bracha, she said, a blessing. I took it as the traditional expression. May my father's memory always be for a blessing. The moment was touching, but in the end there had to be more to mourning my father than visiting sobering tourist sites and drawing out the ritual of Kaddish to comfort me. It grieved me that Dad would always be a prayer away from me. I had to do something more, something dramatic, to find out who he was, but I had no idea what that would be. You have to find someone who knew him when he was younger, my friend Susan advised me. He's always been this much older, unknowable man to you. Get to know him as someone other than your father. Get to know him as a young man, as someone's friend. She was right, of course, but it just wasn't possible. All of his old friends were dead by now. I thought of his happiest times, of the picture of him in Guatemala that I had discovered as a little girl. I thought of the summer when he disappeared, unreachable, while we were in Miami. And there was Anna, the teenager who showed up on our doorstep, unexplained, yet undeniably beloved by him. Sweetie, there has to be someone who's still alive, Susan said. There has to be someone who can tell you about your dad. I thought long and hard about who that person might be. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. That was great. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our next author. Alice Kaltman is thrilled to share today from her novel Dogtown. Alice is also the novel of Staggerwing, a story collection, and two young adult novels, Wave House and The Tantalizing Tale of Grace Minnaw. Her work can be read online and in print in numerous literary magazines and journals. Alice lives, writes, and surfs in Brooklyn and Montauk, New York. Alice, take it away.
Okay, hi. All right, I'm unmuted. Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is great. I know there's like various time zones and interruptions into people's days. So, and thank you so much, Julie, for having me. I'm a big fan of the series and just thrilled to be here. And I love how everyone kind of talks about different stuff before they read. So I had decided that my little spiel before I read from Dogtown was going to kind of riff off of a column I wrote recently for Necessary Fiction. And I was invited to write, it's a column called Research Notes. And when I first heard that term, I got really nervous because I'm going to kind of read a little bit from the column that I wrote, and you'll understand why that term research note made me nervous. It's kind of a loaded word for me because of my educational background. So when I was growing up, I was a very good but restless student. So whenever there was an option to do something more creative as opposed to studious, I always chose the former. I opted to go to an alternative high school. This was back in the 70s, where there were no formal grades and no classes. You basically designed your own program. So that could mean anything from, for me, like working in a laboratory, studying Siamese fighting fish, or diligently smoking weed in the park next door. So it was kind of this really hodgepodge of very sort of self-motivated students and a bunch of kids who were on the verge of being kicked out of high school. So we were really like a motley crew. And when I went on to college, I, always chose to not write papers and not do any research. And again, this is like the 70s, and the college I went to was also a bit loosey-goosey. There were no grades. You could do things for no grades, and there were no requirements. So I would choreograph dances and do them on the roof of the art building and stuff like that. Again, instead of doing research or writing papers, because I never really learned a lot of the basic writing skills, particularly in terms of research. So my post-junior high education was kind of a free-for-all. And while it was a good start to a future of self-determination and discipline, there were significant gaps. And in those gaps grew insecurity, and inside the insecurity grew avoidance. And one of my big avoidances was doing research, because back in the pre-internet days, research meant going to a library, knowing how to use a card catalog, scrolling through microfiche. And the biggest thing was asking questions of like a librarian at the risk of sounding stupid and not knowing what you're talking about. So for someone as kind of restless and insecure as myself, again, I avoided that. So fast forward to now when, basically researching is Googling. I guess I could probably do it as well as anybody else, but I still avoid things that require a lot of research. I kind of have this fantasy that I might at some point like write a historical novel and like learn all sorts of like, little idiosyncratic facts about some obscure subject. But I think my general impatient nature doesn't allow for that. And so for me, so basically, in order to write this column, I had to think like, well, what does research mean to me? And I realized that research for me is really self-search, right? So it's like, it's me kind of researching my own knowledge. And I guess, like Judy, after over 60 years on this planet, and over 30 years now as a psychotherapist, I guess I like to think that I have a somewhat decent understanding of human nature. And so particularly while writing Dogtown, which I'm going to read from later, it meant taking like a beat and closing my eyes and thinking not what would this character do or what would happen, but more like what could happen? Like, how could I stretch sort of unbelievability to its maximum and still keep readers engaged and kind of saying, yeah, okay, that's a little like out there, but I believe it. So that was one of my goals. And like all of the characters in this book have parts that are familiar to me, but as a whole, if you took them, you'd be like, I don't have much in common with any of them, but I have something in common with all of them at the same time. So I think like, and even the dogs, kind of, I feel like this idea of like self-searching as research sort of served me well, particularly with this book. So I would say that like while writing Dogtown was hard but gratifying work, and it didn't require me going to a library or scrolling through like microfiche. I don't even know if anybody knows how to do that anymore, for card catalogs, or even Googling all that much. I mean, I did a little Googling, but not that much for this book. It did require me to ask many questions, and none of them stupid. And I think because after all this time, I finally learned that there's no such thing as a stupid question. And if you guys are lucky, you've all known that already. It took me a while to learn that message. So that's sort of what I want to say about process and this book. Dogtown is told from the perspective of 6 different characters. It's all in very short sections. And there's 6 characters who all live in the same town. Their link and connection is really through their dogs. Some of them actually have real relationships, but a lot of them don't even know that they're connected through some things that happen to their pets. And I'm going to read the first section of the character Abe Kaufman, who's a 30-something writer, who's also the primary caretaker for his toddler son. When the book happens, his son is a toddler. He's also a writer who's struggling. He actually can't write, and he finds all sorts of ways to avoid writing. I guess, again, like in terms of research, I'm not a dude. I don't have a son. While I have had my blocks as a writer, I've never gone through the kind of struggle that Abe has gone through. So yeah, so on that note, I'm going to read you kind of an abridged version of Abe's first section, which is called everything and nothing. To each his own penis, Abe whispered to Milo, as his newborn son lay spread eagle and oblivious on the changing table. Milo stared semi-blindly up at the cars, trains, and planesmobile hanging over his head while Abe wiped away the carrot-colored poo. Milo was only 3 days old when Abe uttered this private benediction. So tiny, Abe could cradle his son's sacred skull in his palm while Milo's body slumped like a hacky sack along Abe's forearm. There had been no moel, no ceremony, no double-edged knives. After 2 sleepless nights, Abe and his wife Claire had laid the issue to rest. Abe could care less if his son had a penis like his own. He was fine with something unsculpted, less yid, more euro. His rose and cream cheese scented boy, his sweet alien creature. The first diaper change, executed without the hovering intervention of Claire, who, sleep-deprived and sore-nippled, had finally conked out in a faceplant on the couch. On that first momentous morning, the infant-loaded diaper couldn't be ignored. Abe pulled back the tape tabs on Milo's disposable diaper as delicately as his cloddish fingers allowed. How was it possible for such a featherweight angel to create, then expel so much? Abe tossed the soggy, loaded diaper in the bin and tried not to think about the pollution, the waste, the synthetics. First diaper change, guys only. Abe gazed down at Milo's uncut nubbin. Such a sweet bump of flesh atop bulbous scrotum. A little rosy dollop. That was when Abe had first uttered this now ritualized diaper change benediction. To each his own penis. Abe wondered, how many days had his own penis looked like this before it had been trimmed according to Jewish law? What had Abe's father Mort thought in the moments before Abe's circumcision? Did Mort reflect on his own splicing as Abe's bloody ceremony took place? Did he wince with empathy at newborn Abe's possible pain? Mort was dead, gone now for 7 years, and even if the surly grump was still kicking around, it was highly unlikely Mort would ever have discussed his nether parts in such detail with anyone, least of all Abe. Mort had named Abe after his dead grandfather, the original Abraham Kaufman, a man who'd escaped pogroms, had been generous to a fault to all his friends and relatives, a king of a guy who ended life a penniless but well-loved mensch. Mort gave his son a traditionally inherited ancestral name and a circumcision ceremony with all the bells and whistles. But that was the end of real Judaism as far as Mort was concerned. He was the poster child for assimilation, as Jewish as a cinnamon raisin bagel and as communicative as a paper doll. Milo began to stir as soon as the air chilled his sodden junk. He wiggled tiny taloned fingers and noodled his hands towards his face as his lumpy peach body curled inward, seizing and searching for itself. Milo wailed, and every muscle in Abe's body seized in response. Milo would wake Claire if he kept crying, and with that thought, Abe had been compelled to action. He'd managed to wedge his fingers between his son's writhing arms and legs, his bear-like hands ungainly and grotesque against Milo's willowy limbs. Milo's miraculous heartbeat like moth wings, his papery eyelids so transparent and otherworldly. Abe's palm came to rest on the mound of Milo's smooth, warm gut, his tiny pillow of a belly, everything and nothing held right there. Abe massaged Milo's tummy in gentle circles, easing what Abe had come to realize 3 days into fatherhood was probably just a bit of irksome gas, an air bubble trying to make its way up and out as a burp, or down and out as a fart. Abe's fingers, large and indelicate, did the trick. A fart. Milo had calmed from the sense of skin on skin, of release. Abe tried not to inhale until all of the brownish, orangish mess was wiped from his son's silky skin, from every fold and bump and orifice, father to son to father, the beginning to the end of the beginning. Oh, that's it. And I'll say one more thing. If you guys, I'm going to put it in the chat if I can. Oh, there it is. If the book is, we're raising money for an animal rescue organization here in the States up until for the rest of the month, which is like 2 more days, I guess. So if anybody wants to order the book now, $4 per order goes to the Animal Rescue Fund of the Hamptons. And I'm putting in the link that goes directly to my publisher, but you can again order it on bookshop.org, Amazon, your local bookstore, wherever. It's still, will still put your money towards good cause. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Alice. I really liked what you said about the research, and I also did a a research note for necessary fiction. That was fun. And maybe in the questions we can talk more about the different kinds of research that all of us have had to do. So now let me introduce Haim. Haim Watzman is the author of 3 books: Company C, An American's Life as a Citizen Soldier in Israel, A Crack in the Earth, A Journey Up Israel's Rift Valley, and a collection of short fiction, Necessary Stories. He has also written more than 150 short stories, many of which have appeared between 2008 and 2020 in his monthly Necessary Stories column in the Jerusalem Report and the Times of Israel. He has translated over 50 books from Hebrew to English. Haim, take it away, and let me spotlight you.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for inviting me. I mean, this is a wonderful thing, and I really appreciate your organization of this thing. I'm a writer, and so I love talking about my work, and I don't often get asked to, so this is great. And I really enjoyed making acquaintance with Alice and Judy's work, and Alice, I am expecting my first grandchild in just a couple of weeks, so I've taken careful notes of the diaper changing process. And it's great to see friends and other writers and people I've collaborated with here. As Julie said, I had this amazing gig for nearly 13 years, writing a short story once every month, every 4 weeks, first in the Jerusalem Report and then in the Times of Israel. Sort of an Besheva Singer old style kind of thing that used to be the standard in any newspaper, but now has fallen by the wayside. But perfect for me because I began my life as a journalist. I'm the son of a journalist, and every time I have a deadline, I do my best work. So having a deadline every 4 weeks to write a piece of short fiction was, for me, an incredible stimulus. And as Julie said, I wrote more than 150. And I also had the wonderful collaboration of a very special illustrator, Avi Katz, who illustrated most of those stories. So that gig has ended, unfortunately, unless some other publication suddenly decides they want to pick it up. But I'm working on a novel now, and I completed a play this past year, and I've had it translated into Hebrew, and I'm now looking for production of that. So when I had to choose what to read today, I had to choose one of my stories, and it's always hard because I really like them all, or almost all of them. And it's a bit frustrating because I really don't have time to read an entire story for you. So I looked for one where I could read a little bit and then tell a story that's behind the story. And of course, there's always a story behind the story, although you should always take it with a grain of salt when a writer tells you how a story came to be written, because I know that it's like a dream, that what actually happens in the dream and what you remember afterwards when you try to piece it together are 2 different things. But I'll do my best. So one of my loyal readers suggested or asked that I read from a story called Masks. that came out in March 2020, just before the pandemic began, just before Purim. It was my Purim story for that year. And I'm going to read about 40% of the story or something like that. And if you want to read the rest, you'll have to go on my website. And I think Julie's going to send out the link also afterwards. And then I'll tell the story behind the story. And masks. Rivka Street ascends so steeply from the traffic light by the Hadar Mall that I often stop to rest halfway up and to reprimand myself for not getting more exercise. Today, I'm puffing all the more because the Punchinella mask that my daughter insisted I wear for Purim is pressing on my nose. There's a little tree I like to stop at because it blocks the view of the open garbage bins on the other side. This Tuesday morning, my spot is occupied. It's a young woman with a two-wheeled shopping cart. Her navy blue cloth coat fits her slim figure well, and I guess that she's in her late 20s, half my age. Her face is smooth and made up, and her hair is covered in a tightly wound scarf, the same shade as her coat. Though there's a cold breeze blowing, she wipes her forehead. She takes a deep breath, as if preparing herself to continue the climb. I can't, under the circumstances, take my usual rest. It just wouldn't look good. So I politely offer to help, and when she smiles sadly, take the cart in hand and pull it behind me. It's heavier than I expected, and I keep correcting my balance. It feels as if the contents shift with every step I take. I feel myself sweating under the mask, not to mention feeling ridiculous. But tonight is Purim, and pretty much everyone in Jerusalem is decked out in a costume of one sort or another. I introduce myself, and she gives her name. It's Orel. Uvanet Zion Goel, she says, a redeemer has come to Zion. Heaven must have sent you. I don't know how I was going to get home. I ask her where home is, and she gestures towards the long train-like housing project on the next street over, just beyond my own building. I've been there 2 years, but I'm still not used to the hill up from the Osher Ad, she says, naming the huge cut-price supermarket on the mall's basement floor. Its name means eternal happiness. You bought a lot of food for the holiday. She's walking at a good clip, and I feel my lungs are giving out trying to keep up. Not so much. It's just me and Yosef Chaim, and he's only 4 years old. So now I get why she's lugging the groceries herself. She leads me into the drive that connects Rivka with our street. A few steps in, I almost lose balance as something big in the cart moves. Then I nearly have a heart attack when the Incredible Hulk's head pops out of it. Can I get out now, Ima? Says the head, whose dank synthetic hair is topped by a black velvet kippah. Orel firmly pushes him back in. Not until we're home, Yosef Chaim. Your father might be watching us. She covers the cart's opening with its flap and makes sure that the Velcro holds. She continues walking, and I follow, looking back at the cart. She turns right onto our street. 3 entrances up, she says, glancing at me over her shoulder. You're very kind. She surveys the street from left to right and right to left and up and down. If she had a pair of binoculars, she'd look like a soldier in an outpost on the Lebanese border after receiving an alert that terrorists have been sighted nearby. I hear the Incredible Hulk's muffled voice. Ima, can I get out now? Orel shushes him. She pivots to turn into the entrance and motions for me to follow her. She's impatient. I'm still maneuvering the cart up the 3 steps to the first landing, and she has the door to her apartment open already. She takes the cart from me and pulls it in over the threshold. Clearly, I'm not meant to enter. She undoes the Velcro, lifts out her son, and places him on the floor. He gazes me with what I assume are large brown eyes, although they are invisible behind the mask. He looks up at his mother and then back at me. What are you dressed up as? It's a mask my daughter bought me. It's Pulcinella, an Italian clown. He runs up to me and punches me in the stomach. Not a clown. Clowns have frizzy hair and red noses. Yosef Chaim, Morel exclaims. That's very bad behavior. And this man just helped me with the cart. Now he attempts to punch his mother, but she catches his hand firmly. I don't want a different Abba, he protests. This is not a different Abba. He's a nice man. She kneels down and takes him in her arms. He's not a clown. I hear the anger simmering in his voice. Then he begins to sniffle. I miss Abba. Is he outside? I looked all around and I couldn't find him, she says. Now be a good boy and go play in your room. I'm the Incredible Hulk. I want to go out and stomp on bad people. It's too cold and I have to cook for Purim. Yosef Chaim walks reluctantly in the direction she points, looking at me over his shoulder. I don't want another Abba, he says, more to himself than to me, as he disappears. I'm divorced, she says through the open doorway. She sounds like she's apologizing. Sometimes there's just no choice. So it was before Purim, and one of my traditional jobs before Purim is writing my synagogue's Purim spiel. So I was very busy, and I didn't have time really to think about the story before sitting down to write it, which is sometimes how my best work comes out. And I wrote the story. I met a woman like this coming up the street, but that's about the only true thing in the story. And I had the idea of masks and how we see people with masks or without masks, and in particular how men wear masks in front of women. That was sort of the basic idea, but I dashed it off, and I have the wonderful privilege of having Michael Kramer of Bar-Ilan University, who in the last few years of my column was my reader. He read every story and gave me very, very good comments and suggestions. Michael had just come back from the States at the time, and I sent it to him, and he came back with a very, very muted response. He said, I think I'm missing something. It might be the jet lag, but I don't get this story. And I thanked him for the honest assessment. And my first reaction was, well, it's trash. It goes in the trash can, and I'll sit down and I'll write a different story. That had happened before. It wasn't the first time that I would have had to do that. But there was something about the story that I said, I don't know. To me, it works. To me, I think it's interesting. And then I thought, it might be Michael's jet lag, but maybe it's a story that needs a woman as a reader. It's true that the narrator and the main character, the person telling the story is a man, but I really think of the main character as Orel, as the woman, and it's about how she sees men, and about how the narrator comes to understand how she sees men. So I sent it to another writer friend, Dahlia Rosenberg, and she got back to me the next day. And again, I'm up on a deadline, so this is. She said, "I think the story works perfectly, both the metaphor of the masks and the Purim timing." So I said, first place, I was very pleased. And I said, I don't know whether I should believe you or I should believe Michael. But I sent it in to the editor at the Times of Israel. And I said, we'll see how the readers react. I don't want to dump on Michael, who's here in the audience, but fortunately the audience reaction was very good. Very positive, and what was interesting was that most of the responses, readers don't often write responses, but when they do, it's sometimes very telling. And in this case, the responses came almost entirely from women, and it was interesting and gratifying to see that. I often write stories from a woman's perspective, partly because I know a lot of women. I'm married to one, and I have daughters, and I think they're very interesting, but also because it creates a barrier between me and the story. When I write a man as a narrator, readers often tend to assume that the narrator is me and that the story is about me. And that's not the case. I don't like writing about myself. I don't think I'm all that interesting. So I think, first place, this is something that happens to all writers, I think, that you get negative responses and positive responses, and you have to navigate. And I think one of the lessons here is not to give up and always get a second opinion when you need to. I think that if I had only had Michael, I would have, as a reader, I would have just dumped it, or I would have started making all sorts of tweaks that didn't feel right to me, but that I was doing in order to try to make it something that he would like. So I'm glad I got Dahlia's response, and I'm glad that readers enjoyed it. And I'm very happy to be able to share it with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Haim. That was great. And I put the link in the chat, so you can all go and read the full story, Masks, which wasn't, it's not in your collection, right? It's not, oh, because it came out afterwards. Wait a sec, I don't want to replace you. I want to add you. I'm going to add all of our authors in the spotlight here. And while I'm doing that, I just want to say I was like nodding my head, agreeing with you, because you like to write from a woman's point of view because it gives you distance. I found the same thing when I was writing my book, that it was easier for me. Sometimes it's easier for me to write from a man's point of view because I don't want to write about myself. And so for sure, that's not me when I'm writing about a man. But in the meantime, guys, please put any questions you have in the chat. I'm going to ask also Judy and Alice to unmute themselves. And while people are adding some questions, I had a question of my own about the research that we all do. And so, Haim, I recently read Necessary Stories, and you have many different points of view in there. And I'm curious what kind of research you do, or when you're writing about someone who you don't have intimate knowledge of their, I don't remember now all the different types of characters you have, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the research, and then we can go to Alice and Judy also to hear more about their processes when they're researching.
Well, I'm like Alice. I like to try to do as little research as possible. I just don't have time. I mean, if I had more time, I would do more research. But fortunately, my work as a translator puts me in contact with a lot of material that provides ideas and characters for stories. And so, for example, I don't remember what stories are in the book anymore and which ones are. But for example, I wrote a story. I don't remember what is in the book. It's one of my favorites. It's takes place in the 1920s in Jerusalem during the Second Aliyah, and it's Erev Yom Kippur, and four chalutzim are there, and they're preparing to have a big meal on Kol Nidrei night in order to show that they're free and not confined by religion. And that story the origin of that story was I wrote it when I was translating Tom Segev's biography of Ben Gurion, which came out a couple years ago, but which I was translating 4 years ago. And there was a passage he quotes from the diary of Rachel Ben Zvi, Rachel Yanait, excuse me, she wasn't Ben Zvi then, about one Yom Kippur evening in Jerusalem. And I just thought that was a really interesting situation, an interesting character, and that's where the story came from.
Judy or Alice, do you have anything you want to add about the research you did? Because then there's some questions in the chat that I can already go to.
I'll just say a word about the research I did. It was ongoing. Some of it was as simple as going through, my parents' house before they sold it, and some of it was as extensive as I won't give away all of the research because it would give away the central part of the book. But my father graduated Yale in 1940, and I did end up going to the Yale Library and reading his class notes, of which he was a prolific contributor. So I learned a lot about him um, through those class notes, particularly the ones before I was born. So yeah, so I did, and I also went to Cuba to kind of walk in my mother's footsteps, so to speak, and I visited her home there, and her neighborhood, and the cemetery where many of her relatives were buried in the Sephardic side of the ceremony of the cemetery. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a couple questions, Judy, for you. I don't know how much you want to reveal, but I'll just read a couple of them and you can decide. Susan Silverman would love to hear about the title of your book. Liz Edelglass is asking if you're willing to share any hints of the secrets of you. And then Sandel is asking, how did your journey to discover your father affect your memory of your father?
Great questions. Full disclosure, these women are friends of mine. But thank you for the questions and the support, ladies. I appreciate it. The title, that's a quick one to answer. I grew up at 1735 Asylum Avenue in West Hartford, Connecticut. So the book's title was really a gift from the universe because my mother, while she was an immigrant and came before Castro took over Cuba, the rest of my family were actually refugees, and asylum, of course, has that connotation of refuge. And when you read the book, you'll see it was a pretty nutty childhood. So that's where the other connotation comes in. As for the secrets, I won't reveal the central one, but I will say that when I went to Cuba, I discovered a couple of things about my mom. And one of them was that she did not grow up in the posh apartment in the posh neighborhood that she said she did. And that was very surprising to me because I believed it. And Cuba was so closed off to us. I mean, the country was on lockdown. My mother's country was inaccessible to us for 6 decades. So that was a surprise to me. And yes, I would say that in answer to the third question, the things I discovered about my dad didn't didn't affect my affection for him, but it did sort of explain things that I remembered about him, odd things that he did, quirks that he had. He was a very quirky guy. He was a very patriotic guy. And the things that I discovered about him, even just reading his class notes, all made sense to me and sort of kind of fit together like, pieces of a puzzle. I think Julie's frozen.
Is she frozen? Yeah.
Yeah. Are you back, Julie?
All right, yeah, I'm back. Sorry, my internet connection is really unstable. I hope that you all can hear everybody well, even if my audio keeps going out. Okay, so I have another kind of comment or question, and it's something that you said, Alice, in your talk when you were doing your research and you were trying to think in your head of not what would happen, but what could happen. I think that's a little bit of writing advice for all of us on the call who are writers, because I'm always thinking what would I, but I really should try to stretch and think about what could happen. So maybe you could each touch a little bit about that, and when you're coming up with your story. And I guess maybe this is more of a question for Alice and Haim, from the fiction writers here. But maybe Judy, you have something to say about this too. I don't know. Can you touch a little bit about that on that process? Can you describe it? Can you give any other advice for anybody else on the line about trying to think creatively and think out of the box? How do you do it?
I guess I can riff a little more on what I had just said earlier. It's a matter of like kind of stretching things as far as they can go, and kind of then taking myself outside of what I've just written and reading it again and being kind of like, yeah, that could happen. I mean, it isn't what you'd expect would happen, but it could. And I have had the problem sometimes where, like with Haim has had with his stories, where I'll have written like not Dogtown necessarily, but like a short story where I think it's very kind of tame, and I'll have people read it, and some people will be like, "Whoa, that character is like that's too, no one would ever say that, or no one would ever do that," and then someone else will say, "No, it was weird and strange, but I totally buy it." So I think part of the process, again, piggybacking on what Haim said, is never just going with one person's take on your story. And that even goes along with like submitting stories to publishers or books to publishers or stories to journals. It's like rejection. It means nothing. It only means that you're putting yourself out there, and that's good. It's just like, I mean, I must say this though, that I have gotten to the point now where if I have a specific kind of story or that has a certain kind of subject matter, point of view, I'm now not necessarily giving it to a lot of people to read. I am kind of giving it to specific people who I respect for certain reasons that I think they're going to give me the feedback on that thing that I need. So I'm not like just blanketly giving stuff out. So makes sense.
I think writing is a very intuitive process, and it's very hard to chronicle exactly what goes on and where ideas come from. But I know that for me, I actually began in my younger days as a playwright when I was a college student. And I've always thought in terms of the theater. And I think if you read my stories, you'll see that most of them take place on a stage, basically. You can see them on a stage. In fact, the play I wrote this past year is actually taken from one of my stories and expanded. And so what I usually begin with is a picture of a character in a space, a character in a particular space, and then the story comes out of the character's interaction with that space. And that seems to be the most consistent thing for me in terms of how I write.
I'll just jump in. Are you done, Haim? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. I'll just jump in and say that a lot of my memoir is necessarily speculative. So I merge speculation with facts, and it's a little equation that I've sort of made up, saying speculation plus facts equals truth, because I firmly believe I uncovered truths, but I don't always have the material proof to back it up. So I'm very forthright about saying that in the book, that this is, some of it is speculating on my part, but there is speculation.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on what Alice was saying, and I guess what Haim was talking about, the different readers. I've had people say to me about my own book, like about the main character, Jeremiah, because he's kind of a cranky guy some of the time. So some people come up to me and say, like, I really didn't like him. And then other people come up to me and say, like, it's me. So you don't know who your writing's going to resonate with. And 100% agree with that persevere advice. You just have to keep putting yourself out there. And if you believe in your story or your novel or your memoir, even if it's getting a lot of rejections, just, keep at it. And eventually it'll find the right readers in the right years. Okay, we have another question from Andrea. When you are writing about emotions, feelings, how important are external facts and background? Who wants to start with that one?
I guess I should start because Andy's a friend of mine and a loyal reader, and in the poem sphere. So I would say the external facts and background are secondary, and that the emotions and feelings of the character are central. But the external facts and background and space add context and take the story in different ways than would have gone in some other with other backgrounds. So I think, for instance, in the story I began to read, that the fact that it's taking place on Purim or just before Purim puts it in a particular context and allows a certain metaphor that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And the fact that it takes place outside along a street and walking up a street is also, I think, very significant in terms of the way the story works out.
Yeah, I guess you could also say, like, you know, external facts, backgrounds, is sort of like the frame, you know, and in that frame is the movement or the painting or the, you know, the guts of the story, but the way it's framed, like where it's set, you know, or the kind of details you add in kind of are the things that, you know, I don't know if I'd say they're secondary, but they definitely, the guts have to be the kind of emotions and feelings, being authentic, right? You know, again, authentic and stretching believability is my kind of, that's my thing.
I think in creative nonfiction, which I do, and lately I've been writing a lot of essays about my mother, factual, so to speak, with some speculation, but a lot of emotion. And I think that emotion is the engine that drives those essays, particularly because I write them in the first person.
Do we have a frozen Julie again? No, there she is.
Oh, hello. Sorry. This is really annoying. Okay, thanks. I would also agree with that the emotion has to be at the heart of it. But I do try to do a lot of research to get the little facts right. I don't know, like to make it more authentic, you know. One of the examples I give is in one of my stories takes place in the World Series of 1932. And I actually, you know, went online and you can find the box scores of every game. And so in my story, there's like, you know, there's like a radio announcer calling out what's happening in the game. And that's actually what happened in the game. So, which, you know, probably nobody really would care about that. But I did then have one reader, it was a Yankees Cubs game. And it took place on Rosh Hashanah, and one of my readers was a rabbi who's a big Cubs fan, and he was like, he went and looked it up. So I'm like, I'm glad I did that research. So for me, I'd say it's a balance, even though obviously the heart of the story is the emotions and the feelings. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? Please put them in the chat now, or you can ask to unmute yourself. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you all, what are you working on now? And also to say that we already have the next Literary Modiin event scheduled because of the holidays. We're not going to have one in September, but the next one will be on October 3rd. So I'm going to put that in the chat now. If you want to register already, that's with Miriam Cohen, Sarah Blake of the guest book, because as I learned, there's two Sarah Blakes who are authors, Jewish authors, and Leah Shire, who's one of my neighbors in Modiin, with her new YA book that's coming out this week. So feel free to register for that already, but you know, I'll be, you know, sharing the word wide and loud all over social media. And back to my question, what are you working on now?
I'll go first. I'm sort of mostly working on promoting Dogtown and also sort of polishing up a short story collection that it's based on sins and the seven deadly sins and the seven heavenly virtues. So it's got a different kind of, it's a linked story collection which people will hear more about in the coming year. Some of which have appeared in already in journals and whatnot, but they're weaved together now.
I'm working on a collection of essays, linked essays. I think they're going to be linked. They're still very much in process, and they focus mostly on my mother's story at the moment. And like Alice, the book just came out with its dual pub dates, and promotion takes a long time and a lot of work, so it's almost like another full-time job. So I'm doing that as well.
As I said, I'm taking advantage of this respite from short story writing to work on a novel, which is sort of new for me. I did write a novel, sort of a novel in stories a few years ago, never found a publisher, but this is sort of a new long narrative for me. And so that's interesting. I've got a few other stories I've written, and I'm sort of in the odd position. I've never had to market a story before. I've always had a place to put it. And so this is a new game for me, trying to find other outlets. And I'm not very good at it, at least so far. But and I have this play that I'm hoping to get
Can you
into.
hear me?
Yeah, I'm hoping to get into production either in Hebrew or in English or in both.
Great.
How many characters play? Sorry.
What?
How many characters are in your play? How many?
There are 5 actors, 3 women and 2 men, some of whom play multiple characters, and it's pretty offbeat. So we'll see.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up. Can you all hear me? Am I unfrozen?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry for my bad internet connection here. I want to thank very much Judy, Alice, and Chaim. It was listening to talk about your writing and hearing what's coming next. I'm looking forward to seeing your play at some point, Chaim. Thank you, everyone who's been on the line. I will be sending out a recording of this tomorrow, so if you missed a bit, you can catch it. If I'll send the link in the email. Thanks very much. Yes, Andrea, there is a mailing list. The best way to get on the mailing list is to subscribe to my newsletter, which I'll put in the chat here. Okay. Thanks everyone, and Shana Tova, and I'll see you after the holidays.
Shana Tova.
Okay.